Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. In our last episode, the seemingly politically indestructible Shirazi dynasty lost control of Kilwa Kisiwani, permanently this time, after a Zanzibari prince named Hassan ibn Talut invaded the island and declared himself the new sultan. However, while the Shirazi dynasty had lost control of the island, they weren't going to let it slip away from them so easily. Today, the chaotic early reign of the Mahdalis gives way to the rise of the most famous leader Kilwa will ever have. Season 6, Episode 11, The Father of Gifts. By the end of Hassan ibn Talut's reign, he had certainly done a lot to transform the kingdom he had usurped. He brought the island, long struggling in a form of economic decline, into a new era of prosperity. He revived the long-dead practice of minting metal coins, and reversed the trend of political power slipping away from Kilwa to instead the nearby Mafia Island, as had been occurring throughout the late Shirazi period. Even the Portuguese mention of Hassan ibn Talut, as brief as it was, refers to him as a skilled horseman, a nice little compliment, good for you. Of course, that's one way of interpreting the comment. The term that they used to describe him, cavaliero, could be also just a general term for gentleman, or could also be a term for warrior. It's interesting that despite his status as a usurper, which the historical record is more than willing to point out, it has almost nothing else negative to say about the guy. However, if there was one thing that you can criticize Hassan ibn Talut over, it was his failure to ultimately finish the job and reunite the Kilwa Sultanate. Indeed, while he had captured the island of Kilwa Kisiwani, the Shirazi dynasty had yet to throw in the towel. From their distant safe haven of Mafia Island, their capital remained under their control. The old royal family continued to scheme and plan for an imminent return. And you can see why they still had this mindset. After all, their dynasty had defeated the powerful usurpers from Shanga. They had survived through multiple failed kingships and regicidal uprisings. Surely this usurper, this Hassan ibn Talut, will soon join those others in the dustbin of history. Just one more failed challenger to their eternal rule. And when Hassan ibn Talut passed away, power passed to his son, Hassan ibn Suleiman al-Maktoum, or al-Maktoum for short. Al-Maktoum faced a tall task in inheriting his father's role as sultan of a kingdom that had been taken by force. Out of all the early Mahdali kings, his reign is documented the least out of any of them, as it was pretty short for some, let's say, unexpected reasons. However, even in this short time, a little over a decade, he was able to get the ball rolling on something that would fundamentally transform the trajectory of Kilwa's history: its religious transformation. Remember that one of the biggest problems facing the early Mahdalis was the sect of Islam that the people of Kilwa followed. The island was composed mostly of Ibadi Muslims, and in order to harden their legitimacy, some of the Shirazi kings had started a long tradition of claiming descent from an important Ibadi scholar and jurist, basically a saint in that tradition. As the succession dispute anecdote shared in our last episode showed, this distinction was taken pretty seriously, with the idea being that as long as Kilwa remained Ibadi, they would not accept anybody on the throne who wasn't directly descended from that scholar. If Kilwa was Ibadi, their loyalty to the Shirazis would be eternal. Al-Maktoum and the Mahdalis were pretty clearly not descended from this scholar, and likely weren't even Ibadis at all. Their family shared roots in the Sunni regions of southern Yemen, and were even, through a distant cousinage, vaguely related to the ruling royal family of that part of Yemen at this time. As long as Kilwa remained Ibadi, their rule would never be accepted as legitimate. Fortunately, Kilwa didn't have much of a class of professional Islamic thinkers at this time, so there wasn't exactly an entrenched Ibadi establishment for the Mahdalis to deal with. On the other hand, this also meant that there wasn't a clear authority for the people to look to on religious matters, who, with their prominent authority, could be coerced into convincing the population to abandon Ibadism. So, without such a figure available, al-Maktoum decided to make one. His teenage son was the perfect choice, the heir to the throne himself. This son could become educated in Sunni Islamic scholarship and return to Kilwa as an educated and well-spoken religious authority, one who the people could look up to and guide the people away from Ibadism. And so al-Makhdun sent his son, a young man named Abu Hassan ibn Suleiman, off to Yemen at the age of 16. He would float up the sea to Aden, a city at this time renowned as a center for global study of Sunni Islam, particularly one of the ideological strongholds of the school of jurisprudence known as Shafi'iyya. From there, the plan was for Abu Hassan ibn Suleiman to go on Hajj, the famous pilgrimage to Mecca, after he had completed his studies. Going on Hajj and winning the title of Al-Haji would further add to his personal prestige and religious authority. After completing this journey, he would then return to Kilwa with his education and prestige now sufficient to become the main religious authority on the island. He could convert the people to Sunni Islam of the Shafi school and end questions of the legitimacy of Mahdali rule once and for all. And so, the teenage son went off on his long voyage. Spoiler alert, don't forget about him. He'll be coming up again later. While the plan to send his son to Aden seems to have been a well-thought-out plan with a strong amount of foresight, it was also a very big risk for al-Makhdun. Seeing that his heir was now out of the country, a group of conspirators decided that now would be the best time to challenge the Mahdali family's rule. It's not clear if what happened next was ordered directly by the Shirazis on Mafia, or whether it was done independently by a group of their supporters on Kilwa, but one day, as al-Makhdun was completing his Friday prayers and was leaving the mosque, an assassin ambushed him and murdered the Sultan quickly and discreetly. Additionally, there is no mention of any trial or punishment, meaning that not only did this assassin manage to get off a successful hit on the Sultan of Kilwa, but that they also likely got away with it. Al-Makhdun, the Sultan of Kilwa, lay bleeding out on the ground, and his son was all the way across the ocean in Yemen. It seems like this would have been the end of the Mahdali dynasty right there. Surely the people will rise, topple the remaining Mahdali loyalists, and bring the Shirazis back to Kilwa in triumph. However, this isn't what happened. The people didn't rise, and instead, without much drama, a younger, lesser-known son of al-Makhdun was elevated to the throne, to serve as a temporary regent until Abu Hassan ibn Suleiman returned. Now, there was some fear that, as is often the case with big air quotes, temporary regencies that happen in monarchies across the world, his brother might get a taste of the power and try to have the long-gone prince arrested or killed upon his return. And so, as Abu Hassan ibn Suleiman's journey was coming to a close after 2 long years, plans were made to test his regent brother's loyalty. The heir to the throne returned to Kilwa not as part of some grand procession, but rather in a hushed and secretive landing, to ensure that his ruling regent of a brother didn't know of his arrival. According to the Arabic Chronicle, the prince's mother set up a clever scheme on how to test the regent's loyalty. One day, she set up a large sheet of silk outside of the royal residence, and quickly called the regent aside for a candid conversation with her and all of the important ministers of the island. Keeping the secret of Abu Hassan ibn Suleiman's return, the council discussed what they would do when the prince eventually came back. In front of everyone, the mother asked the regent directly, give me a yes or no answer, if he would commit on honoring the inheritance and deliver the throne to his brother. The regent agreed and pledged in front of everyone to honor the pact. And in a dramatic reveal fitting of a Broadway performance, the curtain was pulled away, revealing that the returning prince had, in fact, been in the room the whole time. He had heard the pledge and certainly was now safe to come back. After all, how bad would it look in front of all those ministers if he suddenly decided to change his mind? Maybe the regent had sincerely meant his pledge, and all of this was essentially for nothing. But regardless, with all the pressure on the world for him to keep his word, the throne was relented. Abu Hassan ibn Suleiman took over as the new Sultan of Kilwa. Now, as it turned out, Abu Hassan ibn Suleiman is going to be far from an ordinary ruler, and instead will perhaps become the single grandest and most famous leader in Kilwa's history. This next part I've said on the show a few different times, to the point of it almost being a cliche, but I am going to keep on using it because I think that it's just such a good illustration of what I'm talking about. That is that if Kilwa were to be ever added to a historical video game like Civilization, one where they are led by one iconic leader from their past, I'd be pretty confident in saying that Abu Hassan ibn Suleiman would be the best choice for Kilwa. His rule is going to go down in history as the height of Kilwa's power, affluence, international influence, and living standards. In fact, due to his reputation for power, wealth, and generosity, few people are ever going to know this king by his official name, but will rather know him by his prominent title. It's a bit of an Octavian and Augustus sort of deal. Fortunately, this name will also stand out a little bit more, instead of just being a confusing combination of names we've already seen several times in Kilwa's history. Now instead, Abu Hassan ibn Suleiman will be known as Abu al Mawahib, the father of gifts. For this reason, we'll be referring to the Sultan of Kilwa by this name for the rest of the series. So in case there's any confusion, just remember that Abu Hassan ibn Suleiman and Abu al Mawahib are the same guy, just under different names. But when Abu al Mawahib inherited his rule over Kilwa, you could be forgiven for thinking that his rule might be beset with the exact same challenges as his father. Not only did he face the same challenge of trying to wrestle legitimacy away from the Shirazis, but he had also had the further pressure of needing to, avenge his father's assassination. And so he really had no choice but to make his first act of Sultan to be a strike against the Shirazis. He decided to strike in the most direct way possible, gather together an army, and launch a military invasion to capture Mafia Island and dethrone the Shirazis altogether. The campaign was launched and was a success. According to the Chronicle, Abu al Mawahib became the first Sultan of Kilwa to reign over Mafia independently through his own accord. Remember that throughout the history of Kilwa's rule over Mafia, it has always been done with a degree of separation, with Mafia being ruled over by usually the king's son as a vassal, or in later years, vice versa, Mafia the capital, Kilwa the vassal. Abu al Mawahib became the first king of Kilwa to do away with this trend, and instead rule and administer Mafia Island directly. While this ended the sovereign rule of the Shirazi dynasty, though, by this point they were pretty extensive and weren't really going anywhere. They will remain a prominent force in Kilwa's politics and even intermarry substantially with the Mahdalis. But after the capture of Mafia, the idea and prospect of Shirazi rule returning as the sovereigns of Kilwa came to an end once and for all. With his rule over the kingdom more secure, al-Mawahib began to turn to transitioning the religious situation on Kilwa. Since the legitimacy of his rule largely hinged on the pivot of Kilwa away from Ibadi Islam and towards Sunnism, al-Mawahib dedicated a pretty sizable number of resources towards the building of new religious infrastructure to assist in the transition. The greatest of these projects was the building that would one day become the most famous monument in Kilwa's history, and in my view, one of the most impressive feats of architecture in human history as a whole. Of course, I am referring to the Great Mosque of Kilwa Kisiwani. Now it's worth noting that al-Mawahib did not build the mosque without a pre-existing foundation, both literally and figuratively. Before his reign, Kilwa had already possessed a sizable mosque, a considerable achievement in its own right. The old mosque had likely been built in the 11th century and was a square building made out of that same Portuguese coral limestone. The old mosque was already the largest building on the island and the largest religious building in the region, dwarfing all other mosques on the Swahili coast. The building contained also an ornately engraved Qibla, or the wall of the mosque that faces the direction of Mecca towards which Muslims pray, in this case on the northern side of the building. However, even this already substantial building would itself pale in comparison to what came next. Al-Mawahib launched a new mission to enlarge the mosque, almost tripling its old size. The most impressive of the new additions were the new prayer halls that extended east beyond the old walls of the mosque. Their defining feature was a series of short columns that expanded into pointed archways. Each row of archways supported a series of 6 tapered domes, except in sections where they supported long, cylindrical vaults. But these smaller tapered domes were themselves fairly diminutive compared to the grandiose dome that replaced the roof of the old square mosque. The main dome was among the largest in the world at the time of its construction, and a truly fantastic feat of engineering. In addition to its own structural impressiveness, the building was also a triumph in terms of art and design, featuring numerous intricate motifs of geometric and calligraphic decorative inscriptions, as well as whitewashed lime-based paint covering much of the exterior. And, according to the report of a later visitor we'll discuss in depth in another episode, hint hint, the interior itself was majestic to behold, being furnished with a truly breathtaking polished wood shell that covered the coral used in the exterior. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the mosque was just the sheer uniqueness of its architecture, with some of the most well-established motifs of global mosque architecture. For starters, the Great Mosque of Kilwa lacks a sahn, or mosque courtyard surrounded by an arcade. This feature, which is present in almost every mosque around the world, is a pretty glaring omission. Interestingly, the layout of the Great Mosque's prayer halls, consisting of an open space propped up by a series of arched vaults, has led some to conclude that the large prayer hall may have been originally intended to serve as a sahn, but was instead replaced with the more ambitious idea of a covered space as the design was built. This simply might have been taking account of the weather. Tanzania has incredibly intense rainy seasons, and so with this covered space, people would have been able to pray in that region all year round. Even more unusual, though, is the building's striking lack of minarets. A minaret is a tall tower on a mosque from which the caller would shout the call to prayer to the community. It is an essential and ubiquitous feature of mosque architecture, and the fact that the Great Mosque of Kilwa lacks such a feature stands out incredibly strongly. Every other mosque in the region has minarets, and basically every mosque in the world has minarets. Unlike the courtyard, though, there is much less of any sort of concrete idea as to why this is. However, we might be able to speculate that the answer has something to do with the unorthodox composition of the mosque as a whole. Given how strange the mosque is, it seems like this was an intentional choice, that the mosque was designed to look different, and that Al Mawahib was dedicated to the idea of making it stand out from its peers. Not only was the mosque a strong signal to the international Islamic community about the piety of Kilwa's leader, but it was also a statement to Kilwa's population about its religious future. The construction of the Grand Mosque was important too because, unlike its predecessor, this mosque would be a Sunni establishment, one which would become a center for the promulgation of Sunni Islamic practice from the Shafi school of legal thought. No more Ibadism, no sir. This is a Sunni island now, and the mosque proves it. In addition to his mosque, the Sultan also invested into the only building that can perhaps challenge the mosque in its splendor. This was the Palace of Husuni Kubwa. The palace, at the time of its completion, was the single largest known building in the entirety of Africa outside of Egypt. Built from coral limestone, the palace consisted of two large complexes, which combined for over 100 rooms. Additionally, the building featured a large swimming pool, indoor plumbing, and numerous other luxuries. However, the building functioned as more than just the personal vanity project for the Sultan, and contained many valuable public functions as well. The palace complex featured several large warehouses for trade goods, large market stands, traveler accommodations, and a new, more productive royal mint. Al Mawahib was able to afford these expensive projects due to the economic renaissance of his kingdom. While the reigns of his predecessors also had signs of economic growth, the reign of Al Mawahib was a venerable economic explosion, with the state minting more copper and gold coins than it ever had before in its history. In fact, gold is likely the main factor that could be thanked for this boom. Kilwa's tight grip as middleman over the productive gold trade from Sofala became more valuable than ever in the early 14th century. The great 14th century gold shortage in Europe and the Arab world was a phenomenon with multiple causes, including the still reverberating effects of Mongol conquest, the exhaustion of major gold mines in Europe and India, and an expansion of international trade with the reopening of trade routes into inland Asia. Regardless of its causes, though, the effects of the gold shortage were tremendously beneficial for gold-producing regions of Africa, which began to take on an increased significance to their Arab trading neighbors. It is, in fact, not a coincidence that at the same time that Kilwa was experiencing its own rapid ascendance, the Sahelian kingdom of Mali, all the way across the continent, was also reaching its own economic height. Mali and Kilwa would also have another thing in common at this time. In the early 14th century, each of these kingdoms received an unexpected visitor, but one whose time in the country would, in each case, provide us with a detailed look at the society around him. Join us in our next episode as the world-famous traveler and writer, the so-called Islamic Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta, arrives in Kilwa and receives quite the impression. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Iofagbamie, Dimitri, Alexander Travis, Bibi Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Pascal Nwakocha, Joe Maxwell, Nkechi Nwabodike, Kwajo Amankwa, Douglas Harder and Sherry Robinson, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badu, Ghassan Firjiani, Kitty, Mac T, Kelvin J. Norris, Ellen Fisher, Jessica, Tariq Beetleman, Yannick Bolnet, and Shixnay Brennan, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really, 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 really means a lot.